Hey guys, what's going on? My name is Dan and this is Stout Gaming. We are back with another Great Lakes Draft League power ranking, and I am joined today by, as always, Ryan, and our special guest today, Mr. Izzy Max, owner, chairman, and grand poobah of the Max Double League. How are you two doing today?
Doing great.
I'm doing wonderful. This is interesting, and I'm glad to be slightly involved in another draft league.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, thank you for joining us as we are going through another divisional power ranking. We just wanted to make sure that we had some outside perspective on a lot of these teams to make sure our thoughts weren't too inbred with stuff that we were reading in our Discord as stuff was going on. So we really do appreciate it.
For sure.
But without any further ado, we're going to go into the power rankings. As always, the methodology for these power rankings is not who we expect to win the league. It doesn't have any reflection on the coach at all. We just have these teams. Imagine we give these teams to 100 equally skilled players, and they compete in a battle royale where they all play each other. And these power rankings are the final standings that we would expect just based on the team. So Team 7 is not objectively better than Team 8, and so on and so forth. But without any further ado, Maxwell, why don't you go ahead and cover this first team that we have ranked 12th. We've got the Detroit Delmise.
Yeah, so before we jump into this, a little bit of backstory about my playstyle, because I'm kind of going to talk about it a little bit. I am very hyper offense leaning, with kind of a secondary in just more bulky mons that do a lot of damage. And that's kind of where I fell into this team. I actively ranked this team last, not meaning anything. I don't even know who this guy is. But when I look at this team, I see Cresselia as probably your first pick overall. And when you pick that, you actively want a decent Trick Room mode. And the Trick Room mode here really kind of relies on Aggron, which is not great, and the Vika Volt. And just there's other Trick Room mons that will just out damage and just underspeed these guys and not allow you to do what you want in Trick Room. Also, quick note, you see the Comfey at the top. That is, if I'm not mistaken, will be active week 2, right? Not week 1?
That's correct.
Okay. That trade actively makes this team worse in my eyes. When you see the Sylveon and the Comfey, the main thing they want to do, specifically the Comfey, is kind of do priority things with triage. And when I look at a team, I kind of look for what can proc and max. And with the Sylveon, you're going to get a weaker hit into the Hitmonlee. And Hitmonlee can do a lot of damage with that weakness policy and being unaware. Also, you can do some weakness policy stuff with a Liepard. I know me and Ryan in the MVC kind of threw around that idea a little bit. But with Comfey, you're doing way too much damage to that Hitmonlee. I guess you can proc things like the little
Bulwark.
Yeah, you can proc things like that, but I don't really think it's going to matter too much. I just think this team is going to lack in finding an offensive, kind of an offensive personality, and positioning is just going to be rough. But yeah, that's kind of what I got for this team. Why don't you guys go ahead?
So yeah, my thoughts on this team is that it is very proc focused. It has some good support options, but I am a little nervous about the total damage output of the team. Like, Crobat is a great support option. Cresselia is a pretty good support option. Comfey, in the right situation, is a really good support option. It doesn't have the damage output of Sylveon, which I think I tend to agree that I like the Sylveon on this team a bit more. Flapple has the potential for damage. Wishy-Washy, I know a lot of people are high on it. I'm personally not as high on the Wishy-Washy. So I think this team has some decent opportunity to work synergistically, get some nice procs. This team is going to steamroll a couple games just because they get a proc off, and it's the one that their opponent didn't prep for, and that's just going to lead them to win. But overall, if the opponent is able to negate their weakness policy procs, especially on that Hitmonlee, I am a little nervous about the overall damage output of a team designed like this. But what are your thoughts, Ryan?
Yeah, I'm just worried that it's just not going to be enough damage on the whole. There are some. One of the really odd things about this team is really I like looking at modes. quite a bit on times like this. So this team has Tailwind and TR, which is generally something we're going to see on the draft. I rate teams that have both Tailwind and TR pretty highly generally, but I'm not too convinced on the modes. So like, if you set the Tailwind with the Crobat, it's probably for the Vikavolt and the Golurk, and would have been the Sylveon, but Sylveon's not here, so I guess Flapple and Flareon. The TR mode, which is what the TR1 is sort of supposed to do, is Cresselia with the Vikavolt, with the Golurk and Aggron and Wishy-Washy. So like, there's just a lot of like layover there. Like, there's obviously the proc strategies, and they have both of those. I honestly think the best thing this team can do is like a good Tailwind mode with like the Golurk. And I'm just not super convinced that all these picks are gonna be work super well together. Lipard's a great mon in general, but like, it's not gonna do. It's basically just a denial tool on this team instead of something that actively gets momentum. So on most teams, when you have Lipard, it's like Lipard comes out and then it like really facilitates something in a big way. Like, it really helps the team out and it stops what the opponent's doing, and it has this multifaceted layer. And that is, instead, in this case, it's more, I have Lipard to stop other people from doing things, which is fine, but I'm not sure how well it's going to work out. I also think Taunt is generally terrible for this team. If someone has like a Prankster Taunt user, that's very good against most of this team. And item disparity is going to be difficult too. Item usage is going to be a little tough, with a couple mons that are weak to dark, a couple mons that are wanting Mental Herb, couple mons that want Focus Sash, that sort of thing. So we'll see how it plays out. I'm mostly just worried about lack of offensive presence.
One last thing I do want to say, Firewater Grass, we will talk about cores a lot in this video. Your Firewater Grass core is at top tier 4, which isn't fantastic.
Yeah, and the Dragon Steel Fairy, the fantasy core, is with the Sylveon, I like it better, but there's not a dragon type here, and then the steel type's Aggron. So
Flapple's a dragon type.
Oh, and Flapple. So Flapple's your other dragon type. So yeah, it's some of the core synergy is not there, and I mean, even the other core, you draft Cresselia first, one of the first things I think is, oh, you're going to do a dark fighting psychic core, because that's a really good core. I actually built a draft around that, and it's Cresselia, Lipard, Hitmonlee, which is like okay, but I don't love it, defensively anyway, because Hitmonlee and Lipard are too frail.
Yeah, but overall, I think this team definitely has some tools to work with. They've got a lot of good modes, and if the coach is able to really lock into a playstyle and a game mode that works, I could see this team potentially picking up some momentum. But as of right now, we do have it towards the bottom of our tier list. But moving on to the next team, Ryan, why don't you take the Psycho Cut Sceptiles for us?
So yeah, this team is interesting. This is a horse team. We got a big old ice horse sitting there. And then this team has the Celigor Palossand, where you Water Shuriken that, and you proc it. And then he's got Hatterene Togetic, which I really like Hatterene. I think it's a very underrated tier 1 in general. And that's going to be the primary Trick Room setter for this team. And you've got Malamar, Sceptile, Kangaskhan, Wobbuffet. This team is very, very odd in a lot of ways. Horse can just auto-win games, especially with consistent TR and redirection, which this team has. Having Togetic here is very key to keeping Glastrier not burned and things like that. Having Hatterene to set Trick Room next to the Togetic is relatively consistent. It's not as consistent as you might like, but Palossand can help with that. The problem is that if you look at Hatterene, Togetic, and Glastrier, you notice they're all weak to Steel. And you notice Togetic and Glastrier are both weak to Rock. And that's a big deal because max skill spike means that your Glastrier is not doing as much damage as it's supposed to, and Hatterene is not that bulky, or at least not as bulky as you want it to be for max skill spike attacks. So part of the problem here is that the defensive synergy actually doesn't quite play out in the way you want it to, and then the other modes I'm just not super convinced on. Sceptile as an Unburden user, I don't know what the proc is unless Vulpix A gets Ice Shard. Or I guess he can proc it with a Celigore too, potentially, in theory, with a bug move. But, like, that's a little iffy. Kangaskhan's main purpose is Scrappy Fake Out, which is quite good for this team, actually, because it can stop people from stopping your Tailwind setup, but I don't know. There's just some things here. Ditto is one of the most... I'll let Maxwell talk more about Ditto, but Ditto is like a very high skill mon, and it's super difficult to use. Malamar is goofy and fun, but I don't think it does a whole lot here. And Wobbuffet is kind of a meme as well. It doesn't have any traditional type cores, and I'm mostly ranking it where it is because I genuinely just think the Glastrier or Togetic Hatterene, despite the skill weakness, will be pretty good. And Palo Celigore is solid, especially if an opponent does not have redirection. That can be tough to stop if they don't prep well for it.
Maxwell, what are your thoughts on this team?
Yeah, so me and Ryan are kind of clicking on all cylinders with this team. When your main offense and Trick Room core are all weak to the same thing, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but Glacier is just one of those mons that can win a game on its own, which is kind of why it's above the team that was we just recently talked about. But when Ryan says that Ditto is kind of one of those weird mons that has a high skill ceiling, I'm not tooting my own horn, but every draft league, VGC league I've been ranked 1 or 2 consistently throughout the entire season. And I had Ditto at one point, and I absolutely hated it. It is... I don't like being super reactive, and that is all Ditto is. It is just a reactive mon. If your opponent doesn't do what you want them to, and you're bringing Ditto, you're just kind of relying on what they have. And if it's not ideal, or you can't get your Ditto on in the right slot, it's a really difficult mon to use. Like Ryan said, the type cores are just not really here. There's no fire type, there's no water type, just the Sceptile. You don't have an
electric type in this team.
Yeah. There's no electric, right. There's no dark, there's no
There's
steel.
A dark type, Malamar.
Oh, there's Malamar. There's no steel type. There's no dragon. No, like this team is just... If Glacier isn't going off, this team's going to have a hard time. And that's just kind of where this team stops. I know you picked up the Vulpix maybe for anti-weather. And I know at tier 5 you're not going to pick up super valuable picks. But I think Vulpix might need to go to at least cover one of these type cores. And that's kind of where I'm at with this team. Just the cores are not there. Glacier, as strong as it is, I think is really the number one thing keeping this team out of last place.
I can agree with a lot of that. I think the steel weakness seems very pressing from the Trick Room mode on this team. So maybe something like a Magneton in that Vulpix slot is something that I would look at. Maybe Throw or Sock if either of those are available. I don't know off the top of my head. But just something that gives you a little more play against steel types, because right now the plan against steel types seems to be Palisand primarily, and that's an iffy plan just in my mindset, because it also goes away from what you're trying to do with the Trick Room mode, which is the best mode on this team, and that's not really all that close. But with that being said, I will begin to cover the Nexus Ironworks, who we have in the 10 spot right now. So, the Ironworks are a really interesting team. They've got an obvious rain mode with the Politoed, Kingdra, Ludicolo, and then a Blastoise as well, so they're very water heavy. But then they have Lickilicky and Cradily, which are anti-weather and Storm Drain. So there seems to be like a little bit of anti-synergy there. Imagine that the Cradilly's initial thought was with the coal to protect it from water attacks after you trigger it. But the coal's been dropped for a Regieleki, which is going to be really good in the rain mode again with the thunder. There are some decent support options. Obviously, getting up the rain, having Magnezone and Scizor, that's covering some of their biggest weaknesses. Sliggoo, I think, is a decent tier 5 something annoying mod. So I like a lot of the things this team is trying to do, but I think there is some anti-synergy with their support options and their main rain mode. And on top of that, 4 water types just in general makes me nervous. Like, that's a lot of concentration for one type. I know water is one of the best types in the game right now, but that just is a little anxiety provoking for me, because if someone has, a solid grass or electric type, I know you covered a little bit with the Kingdra and Ludicolo, but that's going to start doing some damage to your team. But what do you guys think about this team?
Yeah, so this team actively drops to Rillaboom. I would even go as far as saying it drops to Thwackey. The drop of Colossal, I think, was really smart. I do really like the Alecki here. But with that, you kind of want to get Magnezone off of this team, maybe for something that offers a little more versatility, because you do have the Alecki and now the Scizor, which I actively like in a rain mode. But with what you said, Dan, the Licky and the Cradilly just feel very off-putting on this team. They actively hurt your main source of offense. And I feel like if just the Cradilly and the Licky were something different, this team would jump 4, 5, maybe even 6 slots on this power ranking. But at the current stance of this team, the 6 mons you're bringing to any given match are going to be Alecki, Blastoise, Ludicolo, Scizor, Kingdra, and Politoed. Okay, well, just prep for those, and then if the others come, you're actively hurting yourself. So yeah, if you could just nail down that bottom half of your team, I feel like this is actually going to be one of the better teams and one of the harder teams to actually prep for, even though it is just the run-of-the-mill rain team.
Kind of going off that, I'm so worried about what happens if weather gets denied from you on this team. I'm also a bit worried that some of the offense is a little too specially oriented, and that Max Quakes are going to be quite good in this team in general. Kingdra, of course, can be physical or special. However, Ludicolo, Blastoise, always going to basically be special attackers. Alecki, I've seen physical Alecki, it's a special attacker most of the time. Scizor will be your main physical offense on this team, and I actually quite like Scizor on this team. And Magnezone Alecki could work out, because you can max Alecki, set electric terrain, and then scarf Magnezone, clicks rising voltage. That could work, I guess. But some of the anti-synergy on this team is really what kind of put it down here. I think that the fact that there are some things actively working against a rain mode, and considering there's a little bit of some type things, I actually would consider dropping Blastoise on this team of all things, because I feel like you got 4 water types, and 2 of them are really good at covering that electric weakness, being the electric and grass weakness that it has with Kingdra and Ludicolo. So I don't see any reason to double up on that weakness with the Blastoise if you can avoid it, because Tier 2 has a lot of really good mons there that could really supplement this team quite well. So those are just kind of my thoughts. I think I agree with Maxwell, though. With a couple of transactions, this one shoots way up. But as it stands, little iffy on some of the things.
Yeah, I can agree with those. I think in general this is one of those teams that has 6 things that are going to be really good, but it's easy to prep because you know that 4 or 5 of those 6 are going to be coming in basically every matchup. So if the lower half does get nailed down to be things that complement it and could come more frequently than either Lickilicky or Cradilly with the anti-synergy, then I also agree this team has a skeleton with a lot of potential. We just got to make sure we get the right meat on the bones for it. But moving on to the next team, Maxwell, you want to handle the Milwaukee Mamoswines?
Yeah, so this is one of those teams, when I talked about play style, doesn't really fit what I like to look for in a team. This is one of those hybrid kind of trick room setup kind of teams. You have the Hydreigon with the Togekiss, which is really good, but Dazzling Gleam will still kind of put the Hydreigon in the ground, which is kind of unfortunate. When you want a redirector next to a really good offensive mon, you really don't want that offensive mon to be 4 times weak to a popular spread move. Alternatively, I do really like the Oranguru. I know a lot of people don't really know what it does or what it can do, but just Instruct is just a huge kind of a, not really a move, it's more of an ability because it's the only thing that really sets Oranguru apart from anything else. And the Araquanid is one of the better Trick Room sweepers. With it being weak to Rock Tomb, you can kind of just set it up with a weakness policy, and then it's going to be slower than a lot of those other Trick Room sweepers. And it's just so good, so bulky. I do really like the Bulldoze into the Metagross. As I keep talking, this team is just one huge weakness policy proc team. I feel like items is going to be kind of an issue, though. If you can find where the policy's at, or you can find the focus sash or things like that, it's going to be kind of easy to not let this team do what it wants to. Like I said, it is kind of one of those hybrid trick room setup teams. And if you can't do what you want to as the team that this is, I feel like you're just going to have a hard time kind of going through some of these upper tier teams that we're going to have coming up here next. But overall, if this team goes off, it's gonna sweep.
Yeah, I can agree with a lot of that. The Metagross, obviously, really strong tier 0 pick. It's got the ability to be triggered by the Raikou, which I know, Ryan, you have some thoughts on Raikou that you'll want to share in a little bit.
Of course.
Mainly how you're a simp. But
yeah, pretty much.
The Trick Room mode, I'm very split on. Like, I love Araquanid as a Trick Room sweeper, but Oranguru as a setter makes me a little nervous. Like, it's very value for tier 4, don't get me wrong, but I think most of the tier 3 setters would have been better on this team, but that's neither here nor there. It can get it up. You've got good support for it to get it up. Hitmontop and Togekiss, like I said in the Superior Division breakdown, the team that had Hitmontop and Togekiss, I view those as more really strong ladder mons than really strong draft mons, but I do think they've got some potential to function properly on this team. I like a lot of the pieces on this team. I'm very curious to see how they come together, but if you're able to exploit that priority Tailwind and the Trick Room and have a really powerful, like, dual speed mode, this can be a really good team, but you also seem a little fake out and priority weak yourself. So I'm very, very split on this team, but what are your thoughts, Ryan?
I like this team more than both of you. In general, I like a lot of the tools it has, a lot of things it has going for it. Hydreigon is a polarizing mon because of 4x fairy weakness, and yeah, Dazzling Gleam's gonna kill it, even with Togekiss sitting next to it. That said, it's a super powerful mon. I like the Trick Room mode here. Araquanid's a very solid Trick Room option. I like to, there's some good synergy with the Metagross, not only with the Raikou Bulldoze proc, but also with the Oranguru proc. Oranguru can click the Bulldoze and set Trick Room potentially, so like that gives that some multi-layered options. Haunter can also set Trick Room because I have to make up for this division. I forgot that's Trick Room, whatever. Greedent's kind of a slept-on TR sweeper. It gets Belly Drum and Cheek Pouch, so it can like heal itself a ton while setting Belly Drum, and that's potentially good. It's got Tailwind with the Fletchinder, which I love. Fletchinder has really been popping off in the MDL this season, and I think it complements. I think it complements the Metagross and the Hydreigon really well. And Raikou is just the most underrated mon in draft, I swear, y'all. Crazy good mon. Great offensive sets, great support sets. Got a lot of really strong options. I do agree with the criticisms of this team, but I do want to speak a little bit more positively about it because I really see what this person's going for. They have Redirection, Follow Me, Tailwind. It's just that the problem is that Trick Room and Tailwind are coming from kind of a low tier, and the offensive presence has some holes in it, which is kind of a necessity of taking a tier 0. So I think this team's very good. I'm very excited to see how it's used, and I'm interested to see how their season goes. I'm definitely going a little bit harder for this team because it has some stuff that I personally quite like. But those weaknesses that have been mentioned are very, very legitimate, accurate weaknesses that you need to be very careful about in prep and play, because it can bite you really hard.
Great. Yeah, I agree with a lot of those thoughts as well. I'm very interested to see how Raikou does in a draft when you aren't the one drafting it, considering you draft it basically all the time. So I do want to see what someone else does piloting this mon in particular. But looking at the next team, Orion, why don't you keep your train rolling and take us through the Fluttering Flagons?
This is an interesting team. So it's very proc-oriented. So you got the Cobalion, which you can beat up. Originally, you could beat it up with the Weavile or the Pult. Now you beat it up with the Pult because they're doing a trade for Talonflame, which I quite like. You've got a weakness policy proc on Dragapult itself from the Dust Noir Shadow Sneak and Frostlass Shadow Sneak. You've also got Frostlass sitting here with Ice Shard. Frostlass, Ice Shard. Frostlass doesn't get Shadow Sneak, but Frostlass can Ice Shard the Pult and proc it. It also can proc Anger Point on the Tauros with a Frost Breath. I imagine that's why those two were drafted in tier 4 together. Cottony's a good Prankstermon. It doesn't get Tailwind though, just a reminder to everyone in the audience, but it still gets a lot of the same stuff Whimsicott gets. And Indeedee is a great redirector. The big problem I have with this team is mostly if the setup doesn't pop off, this team's in trouble. I'm very worried about what happens if things don't get going the way this person intends them to. I also think it's a little too physically oriented. Pult can be special or physical. However, Cobalion's physical, Talonflame's physical, Dust Noir's physical, Azu's physical, Frostlass doesn't do a lot of damage. Indeedee can do damage, but it's typically just mostly like chip damage. Even Heatmores usually run physical because you want the Fire Lash. So like, it's a little bit too far on that side for me. And while the setup options are quite good, and I think they're all fairly consistent and solid, I am worried about what happens if the opponent preps and can stop those. So those are kind of my overall thoughts. I do think this is a solid team. It's got Tailwind Trick Room, it's got Redirection, and it's got some solid offensive threats, and I quite like how a lot of it kind of works into each other. But the type cores are a little weird, and there's just a couple pieces kind of missing. A great fantasy core, though.
Yeah, I can agree with a lot of that. The beat-up options, I think, are going to be pretty solid as a form of damage output. The Dragapult is always going to be really strong, and Dragapult and Indeedee together, I really like the two of them as a combo. I know it's not the same as Dragapult Clefable or Dragapult Clefairy, but I do think there is some hidden synergy there that could be really good, specifically the redirection of ghost attacks into the Indeedee, which is immune to them. Otherwise, I'm generally a fan of this team. I think Azumarill is criminally underrated in draft. That thing hits everything like a truck. I think that Talonflame swap is actively really good because you didn't need the Weavile to do what the Dragapult can already do, so it gets rid of some role redundancy and differentiates the threats and modes a bit more. And I think everything just generally seems like it works on this team. Everything on this team, I'll put it like this. If I'm rating different modes on a scale of 1 to 10, this team's got a bunch of things that I would put in the 7 range. It doesn't have anything that's just overwhelming, it's going to win the game by itself, but it's got a lot of things that are really solid, and it can fill a lot of roles really solidly. But Maxwell, what do you think about this team?
So this is going to be kind of a weird, potentially hot take, but I think non-Psychic Surge Indeedee is actually actively better for this team. It has a lot of priority modes kind of that it wants to go kind of wants to hammer in, If you're going to set maybe like a Belly Drum Aqua Jet with a Azumarill, you don't want Psychic Terrain up. If you need to Ice Shard a Landorus, you don't want Psychic Terrain up. You got Shadow Snakes. Heatmore also gets Sucker Punch. Anything you want to do prankster wise with the Cottony, you can't really do with the Psychic Surge up. So don't be surprised when you see this Indeedee come out and it not have Psychic Surge, because I think it's actively better for some of the things that this team potentially wants to do, at least what I would want to do with it. But the setup options on this team are just absolutely insane. This is another team that if it gets set up, it's probably going to sweep you, but if it doesn't, it potentially just crumbles and falls flat. Some of the options on this team I really do like, and I would run myself. Hell, I have ran myself. But yeah, the Psychic Terrain on this team actively hurts, but potentially actively helps, because some of these setup options are weak to popular priority.
Yeah, I think that's going to be an interesting week-to-week decision on the Indeedee, whether or not to bring the Psychic Terrain variant, and I think that type of mind game you can play with your opponent also can help you both on the first team preview screen and in prep. So I think that's something that a skilled coach will be able to leverage, and I do like the points about no Psychic Terrain Indeedee potentially helping this team certain weeks. But with that being said, I'm going to take a look at the Belgium Beldums. So this is an interesting team. We're going to ignore the Beldum because he just picked his mascot, and it doesn't really... I'm not going to count that against him, but it is a tier 5 slot that he's not using. The Celesteela is very powerful, just almost by itself, and then you've got a Pelipper and a Raichu, which cover its 2 weaknesses. So right there, you've got amazing defensive synergy just off the bat. The Meowstic, I believe that's the Prankster Meowstic, is going to be decent support for the Celesteela as well. Noivern can set Tailwind for it, and it gives you a really strong Fantasy Core with Noivern, Feeny, and Celesteela. But so there are some really good things on this team. The lack of a Trick Room makes me a little nervous that this team just is mid to fast, and if an opponent can get under its speed with Trick Room, there's not a lot of counterplay for it. Like, maybe your Turt is your counterplay, but I don't think Turtonator's that great, even though it was a highly sought-after Tier 4 in this draft, in all 3 divisions. So generally, I think this team does really well covering a lot of the weaknesses of the big threat, and it's set up to protect the big threat and let the big threat go off. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it is a pretty focused thing. And if Audino was a fairy type like it should be, this team would have 2 fantasy cores, but instead it's a normal type, so they only have 1 fantasy core. But what do you guys think about this team?
So I am the #1 hater in Tapu Fini in Draft League. Anybody who knows me and talks to me, I will actively tell you Fini is not worth a tier 0 pick, at very least a tier 1 pick, when you have very limited number of them. In the MDL, when we had 3 tier 1 picks, I could maybe pick Tapu Fini, but when you only have 1 or 2, I actively hate it. I've ran some calcs with it, defensive and offensive. It just doesn't hit the numbers. And I actively think it's the worst water type, specifically because Pelipper is setting the rain for said Celesteela. And that is, looking at this team, going to be your main source of offensive damage. So in my eyes, based on how I play and what I think of Tapu Fini, I would honestly look for a more offensive tier 1, because this team has so much going for it when it comes to defensive versatility. You have the Thunder Waves, the Charms, and all that coming from the Meowstic. You have a Rain Setter for your Steel type, who, again, is your main source of offense. You have Raichu with Fake Outs, Nuzzles, and Lightning Rod in general just being super, super good. I just feel like Fini, you're going to try to use it, and it's just not going to get the calcs that you want. And more than likely, it's going to be sitting the bench on this team. But other than that, since you have the Noivern, I feel like Turtonator could be a different Trick Room sweeper. I've tried using it before, and if you're not getting a Shell Smash off with it, it just kind of doesn't do anything. But with that being said, you're going to win games off Celesteela, Raichu, Pelipper alone. So I think that if you can maybe pick up another just like grade A threat offensively, this team is actively maybe one of my favorites. Finny is one of the reasons I put this team kind of low. I don't know if it's tunnel vision or what, but if this team had one more offensive sweeper, it is absolutely a huge threat.
I agree. I personally I love the Stila, and the ideas with this comp are great. I love the Noivern pick. I like Meowstic Prankster stuff. I like the Raichu. And I think Leafeon's generally a pretty slept on mon. I actually think it'll be super good on this team because like Stila can like set Max Flare and then you can Chlorophyll boost and stuff. It'll be great. I think Spiritomb is one of the best tier 5. Same with Audino. All both really solid. I don't love Turtonator myself, but I think it's in terms of attempting to be a Trickermancer, I think it's okay. But man, if that Finny was swapped out, or if we had something swapped out for just a big threat, man, this team would be so good. I think it's already pretty good, but like if it had that other big thing than the Stila that you really had to center your prep around, this would be just a super tough team to beat, I think.
Yeah, I can agree with that. It is very centralized in threats. Like in tier 0, imagine Landorus T in that spot.
Mm-hmm.
I know that would give you another flying type, and then you'd have 4 of them, so maybe not the best thing, but just off the top of my head, something in that vein that can just hit the field, be quick, deal some damage, and I do think that this team, it does help the team, but right now with the one centralized threat, I think this team does about as good a job as you can with one centralized threat.
Yeah, one thing I didn't say though, once Raichu goes down, you spam electric moves 100% of the time and sweep this team.
Yeah, you've got to play this team kind of careful. The ranking for this team was a little tough because it was difficult to determine if the offensive threats outside of the Stila were solid enough and if the support was good enough. Ultimately, I leaned on the side of the support being good enough, but the other offenses not being strong enough, which is kind of why it got placed here.
Yeah, absolutely. I did think this was a pretty interesting team. But speaking of pretty interesting teams that might be a bit centralized around 1 or 2 strategies, Maxwell, why don't you break down this team for us?
This is your prototypical, I have Moltres, and I'm going to win with Moltres. I actually like this team, but if one of your strategies for winning is going to be a Perish Trap, you lost points in my eyes. Perish Trap doesn't really work in draft leagues all too much. It's a best of 3. If it was a best of 1, sure. But being best of 3, you're not going to get that off. Granted, though, I do really like the Gothitelle on this team. One thing that me and Ryan actually were talking about was if you max the Lapras, get the screens up, Lapras unmaxes, and then you proc the policy on the Moltres, and then just sweep from there. This team is very threatening. I really like the Entei. I believe that's one of the more underrated of the 3 dogs. Everybody kind of knows what Suicune does. But Entei is one of those mons you can't intimidate. It does massive damage, and it can kind of just sit there. It takes massive hits. I know I've ran AV in Series 7 or 8, I don't remember. But Entei was one of my favorite mons. Also, when you're relying on a Togedemaru to kind of help your offense not get completely demolished, it kind of feels a little bad. I am a big believer in Togedemaru, but it's not one of those mons that you really want propping your offense, as well as Flygon is a bit overrated as a Pokemon. But if you are able to, like you have dual Fake Out and get like a Dragon Dance or 2 off, Flygon is a huge threat. The one thing that really puts this team down in my eyes is the Slurpuff. Fairy is one of those typings that every draft really needs to have. Last season in the MDL, my Fairy type was Tapu Bulu, and I really felt it not really having any actual fairy coverage. And you have no way of really proccing the Slurpuff. You don't have Terrain. You don't have Bullet Punch or anything. So I feel like when it comes down to the stretch, if this team makes playoffs, something that's weak to fairy can just kind of run up on this team. And I feel like that's where this team's going to kind of crumble. But yeah, this is one of those weird ones. It's just super centralized around the Lapras and the Moltres, to where I feel like if you're good at prepping, you're going to be able to prep around those things. But the Entei, I do think, gives it a couple more points in my eyes as an offensive threat.
Yeah, the draft strategy behind this team was pretty odd to me. I'm not going to say that it was outright bad, but the Lapras and the Moltres were not the first pick. The Gothitelle was the first thing that was selected, and then it was built out from there. I don't really think that should affect the power ranking at all, but I just thought that was an interesting note that this coach really valued Gothitelle, and hopefully they're able to show a way to maximize the potential of the Gothitelle, because they don't really have a lot of physical attackers that are weak to Intimidate, since Entei is immune to it. So I think the draft strategy is going to be pretty interesting on this team. I do really like the Entei pick. Like, I think that's a sleeper pick here. I think it's one of the stronger tier 2s, having a 50% burn chance on a base power, I think 100 move. That's nice. That is very nice to have on your team. So I think it's going to put in work. But this team will go as far as Moltres can carry it, and I think Moltres has the potential to carry it pretty far. But if you've got an opponent who's pretty good at shutting down Moltres, you might struggle to break through some of their bulkier mons. But Ryan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's some cool stuff on here. I do think the Tangela redirection is something we haven't discussed yet that I quite like. I also like Tangela just in general on this team. I think it helps a lot with a lot of the options that they're going for. Lets you set up a nasty plot a little bit more safely on the Moltres if you can afford it. It's a nice redirector just in general. You can like click Max Flare with a Max Entei and then Chlorophyll boost your Tangela and get like fast sleep powders off. That's kind of cool. But there's just some misplaced stuff here. Throw is one of the best tier 5s. I don't love it here. Cherum's a solid mon, but if there's no consistent sunsetter, I don't see the point. Flygon's, I think, pretty overrated in draft. It just doesn't get the calcs you need, and it's so dead to ice moves. It's kind of ridiculous. You can't even ice shard proc it with Lapras, really. Or well, I guess you could with Glaceon, but Glaceon's actually kind of a solid mon. I like it a lot. I think it's underrated in draft. It's pretty good. Slurpuff, I'm running Slurpuff right now with Terrain and with solid stuff to support it, and I'm not insanely impressed by it, and the fact that this team has neither of those things is very concerning to me. But I do think this team has a bit of a 6-mon syndrome. Almost every game is going to be Lapras, Entei, Gothitelle, Moltres, Tangela, Togedemaru. That's going to be your team almost every week. And part of my issue with that being team almost every week is that if Lapras doesn't max, Lapras does poorly. So one of those, because if Lapras can't max, it's like a tier 3 if you're nice, usually a tier 4 Pokemon. So there's an element here where I'm quite worried about, like, if Moltres goes down, if it doesn't get set up, if Lapras isn't the max option, but it's one of your 6 mons anyway, and it just is kind of a wasted slot for a game. If Togedemaru goes down, an electric type can go in. I mean, an electric type can still potentially go in. If someone has Discharge, Discharge looks so good into this team, because Lightning Rod doesn't stop that. So there's just a lot of factors to consider here. I think that in terms of funneling all your stuff into Moltres, it does a pretty great job. I think there's a couple lower tier picks that are solid. Glaceon and Throw being the 2 ones that I'm like the most sold on. But yeah, it's just kind of what it is. Gothitelle's a great Pokemon. I think it's one of the best tier 3 mons. That said, Trick Room is still not crazy looking great for you. Trick Room looks very solid into a lot of the team, and I do think I'm a little worried about that as well. I know Goth gets in prison, whatever, but it's a pure fairy. It's a pure psychic type. You can take it down with appropriate prep to not too difficultly, without too much difficulty, I should say. So, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of potential upside to this team, but I do think Trick Room is something that they will have to be very conscious of throughout the season, as if people can bring Trick Room against this team, they probably will. But moving on to this next team, Ryan, why don't you talk us through the Coughing Smokers?
This is an interesting team. So one thing that really stuck out was that this team has the best Firewater Grass Core and the worst Firewater Grass Core at the same time, because it has
that
two
was my
separate
line.
ones. You can say it too if you want when it gets to you, but it's funny. And hey, we both talked about it. We both had the same comment. I was the one who pointed out it had two cores anyway. Anywho, Rillaboom Marowak A Slowbro is an amazing Firewater Grass Core. Like, super, super strong, super solid. And then you've got Rotom Lantern Torcat, and I guess you can toss Walgreen in if you want instead of Lantern, which is just not one of the worst. But this team has a lot of things going for it, I think. Torcat's very value. It's one of the best tier 4s in my opinion. It's got Intimidate, great support, move pool, fake out, that kind of stuff. Sigilif gets Tailwind, so you have Tailwind on this team, and you have Trick Room with the Slowbro. You've got the Snorlax here. Snorlax is a very threatening mon. Butterfree I've seen do surprisingly well in draft, mostly off of Rage Powder sets. This team will most likely be doing Rage Powder stuff to get the Slowbro off a little more consistently. Umbreon is just super annoying to deal with. It's a hard mon to kill, offers some solid utility for the team. My big concerns are I'm a little worried about dark types into this team, just in general. The Slowbro and the Alolan Marowak and the Sigilif are all dark weak. And if you notice, Slowbro and Sigilif are the Tailwind setter and Trick Room setter, like the primary ones, respectively. Butterfree, I think, also gets Tailwind, but it's still dead to a max darkness. So, like, part of my concern is that, like, there is a little bit of a type weakness there. However, the raw damage output this team can put on is kind of incredible. I mean, Slowbro is an insanely good mon in of itself. Don't ever sleep on Snorlax. Rillaboom is a monster. I kind of like it paired with what's here. But I wish there was some more traditional type cores as well. I feel like if this team, instead of like Rotom had like a good fairy type, dragon type there, or if the tier 5 picks kind of reflected that too, I would be super, super high on this team. I think it's very solid.
Yeah, I can agree with a lot of what you're saying there. I do think their Trick Room mode is phenomenal. I love Marowak A, especially next to Slowbro. I think those two have a lot of good synergy together. Like, you can redirect electric attacks into the Marowak A, and they cover each other's weaknesses very well. I think, like you mentioned, Torracat, really good value support option. Umbreon, really good value support option. Butterfree, I'm a fan of it in tier 3. I like that pickup. I do think there's a lot of solid threats on this team, but I am a little worried about the differential of damage output. At this point in the draft, we're going to be getting a little more nitpicky, and it is very physically oriented at the top. So Intimidate does make me a little nervous, and then outside of Marowak, Rillaboom, and Snorlax, this team's sort of low on total damage output. Like, a step down from that, Slowbro and Rotom can do some damage output, but it's not great. And then we got a lot of support mons that don't do much damage overall. So that's one thing about this team that I would be a little worried about, is making sure that you've got enough damage dealing threats to go with all of your great support options as well, and to make sure that you don't just fold to a couple cycled Intimidates. Maxwell, what do you think about this team?
So if Rotom, Torracat, and probably Lantern at this point was any even subpar Fairy Dragon Steel, this team potentially is second place. I really think having 2 of each and 3 in some points with the water really just hurts this team so much. When it comes to support, I really do like both the Butterfree and Umbreon. I've used both of those, and they just feel really good for what they want to do. Umbreon also just kind of makes Torracat not really just want to be there. It does some of the same things. I mean, of course, Umbreon doesn't get fake out and intimidate. But like Umbreon is probably harder to kill than a second fire type. Yeah, if that is just my biggest point. I love everything about Rillaboom, Slowbro, Marowak, Snorlax, Butterfree, and Umbreon. Just everything else on this team doesn't do it. You need more of those cores. You don't even have a fighting dark psychic core. You don't have a flying electric ground core. You're just missing a lot of the typings that really make teams hard to prep for. Because if I look at this team, Rillaboom, Marowak, Slowbro, Snorlax, Butterfree, Umbreon, that is all you're bringing, because if you bring your other grass, fire, water type, you're just not doing it in damage, support, speed, just any of it. You really have 6 Mons, and 4 Mons need to be something else. But for you to be ranked this high with just, honestly, those 6 Mons is fantastic. I think you did a really good job with those 6. Just the other 5, other 4, yeah. Need to be something different. Complete a core. Different core.
I like Sigil. Okay, calm down. Actually,
no, Sigilyph is fine.
Sigilyph could actually potentially be something like Unpheasant if it's the Tailwind bot for this team. I'm just going to toss that out there. I'm using Unpheasant as my tier 4 Tailwind, which, like, maybe I'm biased there, but that doesn't double down on a dark weakness. And you still maintain a flying type with Tailwind there and get a normal type as well. I don't know. It's kind of a mixed bag because you also have Snorlax, which is a type, so I don't know. If you end up thinking, hey, Sigilyph's not working, I will provide a random suggestion for that. But yeah, no. I agree, though. The things that kind of need to go on this team would be the Rotom Mow, the Lantern, maybe the Torracat, stuff like that.
Yeah, just complete another core. A secondary core makes this team incredibly better.
If you're looking at a tier 3, 4, 5 core, like, if you give me something like Alchemy, Dradagon, and Doublade, I immediately love this team a lot more. I know that's a weird one, but that fits I think that would fit the team a lot of places.
Hell, give me Berserker instead of Torracat.
Facts. Literally facts.
That might be stretching it a bit, but we'll leave that.
No, Berserker is great and it gets fake out.
Okay, fine. We'll consider we'll consider a recommendation of Berserker, but I still have my doubts. But moving on to the next team that doesn't need Berserker is the Latchkey Kids. And if you tell me this team needs Berserker, I disagree. But
hey, Steely Spirit Heatran boost, I mean, that's a lot of damage.
That's a lot of damage.
That's a lot of damage. Don't.
Okay, so Latchkey Kids, coached by the Fifth Leaf, he's running Perish Trap. Next team. No, I'm kidding. So for those of you who aren't aware, the meme is that Fifth always runs Perish Trap, and then he never actually does it, but it is an option on this team. It is Primarina Dugtrio. It does exist and might come one week. But besides that, the actual good parts of this team, the Primarina is fantastic. I really like Drampa as a Trick Room sweeper. Dusclops is going to be a pretty consistent setter. It is kind of taunt bait, but it is going to be pretty consistent. Purloin in the free slot, that's a lot of value. Jolteon I always think is one of the better tier 3s. He does have the Virizion, and I believe he's got something to hit it with beat up. I think actually Purloin, no, Dugtrio is the one with beat up into Virizion.
Yeah, the Dugtrio Virizion.
Yeah, so he's got a way to activate that. The Heatran is going to be pretty solid. Normally I don't like Heatran without redirection, but I think Heatran Primarina actually checks a lot of boxes besides just being a lot of good types that you want on your team. And I'm a big fan of the cores on this team. Like, Primarina, Heatran, Virizion, and Drampa, that covers your Fire, Water, Grass core and your Fantasy core right there. And I think that's a really good, solid way to do it because you've also got that speed control options, you've got multiple Trick Room setters, and you've got a Tailwind user as well. So I'm a pretty big fan of this team. I think it'll come out pretty well. Don't know what the Stunfisk is doing, but everything else I'm a big fan of. What about you guys? What are your thoughts on the Latchkey Kids?
So I'm super high on this team. I really like that you were able to get 2 cores and 4 mons. That is fantastic. I know you're high on Jolteon, but your Trick Room mode or your Trick Room answers kind of comes down to only being the Drampa. So maybe just experiment. One thing I was talking with Ryan, that this team actually would really like Pincurchin, as weird as that sounds. That also gives you terrain if you need it. And I just really, I really like Pincurchin. Jolteon is doing some of those, but Lightning Rod is actively better than Volt Absorb. But yeah, no, I am very high on this team. The sole fact of Heatran, Virizion, Primarina is just so good and will win you games on its own. Just those 3 mons. And I also believe Drampa is just super good. So if you look at it, you have a lot of immunities as well. Heatran checks that fire immunity for the Virizion. Drampa checks that grass weakness from Primarina. And the list honestly just goes on because you got the Dusclops getting the fighting weakness away from Heatran. And I actively love the top end of this. Not too sure what, I think it's Zatu or Not2, whatever that thing is. I'm not actively for sure what it does. I've never used it or seen it. Is that
it's a Tailwind bot. Okay. It's basically a Tailwind bot. I think it also gets Imprison Trick Room stuff.
Yeah, it gets Trick Room, Imprison, and Tailwind and screens.
Yeah, so like it's basically like Articuno Galar, but like 8 times worse.
Okay, yeah, I've never seen it used, so I'm excited. I don't know what it does here, but I think it could
solid.
Be decent. I think you're actually going to get a lot of surprising use out of Purloin on this team. Being able to set weathers for these sweepers, I believe it gets Rain Dance and Sunny Day, does it not?
Yep.
Yes.
It should get both.
Yeah,
My part gets both.
So there you go. You're setting up for both of your 2 main offensive modes, and I just couldn't be higher on this team other than the next teams coming up. But I absolutely am a firm believer in this team. Yeah,
me too. Actually, the Zatu is one of the things I love the most about this team. I think the Tailwind mode here is super strong, mostly because Primarina and Heatran just totally slap under Tailwind. They're both kind of mid-speed mons that need some form of speed control, and I think that's covered nicely here. I will tell you, I have used Heatran more than anyone on Earth. These 2 can attest. Generally speaking, I do like redirection with Heatran, but I don't see it as a huge issue on this team. Especially if you're smart with your ally switches on Dusclops for the ground weakness, or with I think Zatu gets ally switch as well. So if you're smart with some of that, that will help you out a lot. There's a lot of power here. There's a lot of good stuff. I'm a little worried about physical offense though. Heatran, I've run physical Heatran before. It's actually not as terrible as you might think, and I probably sound insane right now, but it's fine. But in general, there's not a lot of physical offense on this team. Virizion requires the beat-up setup to actually do good damage, and does have a 4x weakness. And the Heatran and Virizion both having 4x weaknesses is actually my biggest worry about this team, because Max Quake and Max Flying are both really, 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 really good max moves. And they're actually solid into this team as a whole. So I do think you need to be this team is going to require some caution to play with, because of those big type weaknesses, and because those mons don't have anything super crazy to help them out in that respect. I think if you could get I quite like the Purloin here, but I'd almost rather see something like some kind of redirection would be nice somewhere. would be good, or just something to mitigate that a little, because that's my big concern. Is I'm worried that those max flyings and those max quakes could really hurt this team if they come off at the inopportune moment. But I do like this team a lot. I think it synergizes super well. I actually do like the Jolteon. I don't think you would. I think you should play around with the Jolteon and see how it fits. If it doesn't fit, maybe consider our Pincurchin suggestion. If it fits great, then don't change that, because I like Jolteon. But those are kind of my general thoughts. I do like this team a lot, but it has a lot of stuff I've used before, so I do have to, especially that Heatran, and I do have to caution you that, like, you have to be very cautious with that mon.
All right. Well, I think that basically wraps up this team, but let's take a look at the Gardener Guzzlords. Maxwell, you want to tell us a little bit about this team?
This is setup.team. This team is absolutely insane if it gets set up. And even if it doesn't, you kind of have to be wary of some of these threats. Serena is probably my number one grass type I look at drafting every single draft. And then you have things like the horse Mudsdale and Grimmsnarl. You have Dracloak and Arcanine for beat up. You have Tailwind support. Hell, you could even proc a policy on the Tornadus with the Cryogonal. I actually really like the Toxicroak here. You can also do a physical slow king the same way you can do with Mudsdale and the Grimmsnarl. I think the Magnezone here is actually really smart, being faster, or the Magneton being faster than Magnezone but doesn't hit as hard. I actually think is better for this team, since you do have that priority Tailwind. And I just cannot stress enough how important the Serena actually could be on this team. Negating those priority Will-O-Wisp from like a Sableye maybe, or anything from a Purloiner, or fake outs, or just a whole slew of things that Serena can kind of check. And it's also a decent like AV max mod. It gets a lot of coverage. I just feel like the synergies on this team are really, really good. You got a really good Firewater Grass Core in Arcanine, Serena, and Slowking. Your Dragon Fairy Steel Core is a little lacking in damage wise, but you're really using that Fantasy Core more for the setup, i.e. the Grimmsnarl and the Dracloak. You have the dark fighting psychic mode, which is great. This team checks a lot of the boxes I actually look for. And I think it's going to be really hard for people to prep, because if you're prepping for Mudsdale to go off, you're prepping your flying types, you're prepping your water types, stuff like that. Oh, then it turns around, it's actually a physical Slowking doing the same thing that the horse is going to do. So this team can pivot really, really fast. And if the team you're playing against can't pivot as fast as you can, this team's going to overwhelm you. And I just absolutely love it.
Yeah, I can agree with a lot of that on this team. Arcanine, a few weeks ago, I wasn't entirely sold on how good it was. Like, I knew intrinsically it was good, but I've been using it in another league some, and it's phenomenal in its flexibility for how many different roles it can fill any given week. The Grimmsnarl next to the Tornadus as your 2 tier 1s, that's the one part of this team that's a little iffy to me. I would like to see at least one of those, even the Tornadus is even a tier 0, have a bit more consistent damage output, but I do think the damage output for the rest of the team is pretty good. The one thing I would worry about, though, is that it is just pretty good for the rest of the team. Like, everything needs to be set up. There's nothing that you can just send out late game and guarantee, like, get a kill with to close up a game. Like, you need to make sure that you're maneuvering the mons carefully. So it's a team that I think has a really high skill cap compared to a lot of other teams, and if that skill cap is properly employed, it's going to be awesome. But there's also a lot of opportunity for user error, potentially more than in some of the other teams we're going to consider, which is why I think we docked it a little bit. The Cryogonal and the Mudsdale, I do love that combination, and I do really want to see it, though. But Ryan, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, just gonna touch on a couple mons we haven't discussed as much. I really also like Toxicroak, like Maxwell. Toxicroak does not fit most teams. This team, it does a really nice job. I'm worried about a little too much physical offense. The Grimmsnarl is physical, Serena's physical, Mudsdale is physical. Torn can be special, but it's gonna be physical most of the time. Arcanine's typically physical, but it can be special. But it's not super insane in either. And Slowking is kind of the main special attacker in my mind on this top. I really like the Dracloak here a lot because it frees the Grimmsnarl up quite a bit. It means Grimmsnarl does not have to run screens, Thunder Wave every single week. If the Dracloak needs to do it for a week while an offensive Grimmsnarl goes in, then that option's available to the Guzzlords, which I think is huge for a mod like Grimmsnarl, especially in Tier 1. I really like that support synergy there. Icicle Spear into Mudsdale is insane. It is insanity. I think the Torn is going to do a lot of good work. I even think you could just like Brutal Swinger Arcanine or Brutal Swinger Weakness Policy Slowking and just click Tailwind and go on with that. Like, there's so many cool, weird options that this team has available to it in terms of how it wants to go about playing the battle. It's very much a team high on versatility and synergy. That sacrificed a little bit of power, but I think it's really going to work out for him in the end, especially if they play it well.
Yeah, I do think that this team has potentially the biggest range of where I could see them finishing this season, and that's something that I like in draft teams because I like a coach that will bet on their own skill as a player, and I'm excited to see if it pays off. But moving on, Ryan, why don't you talk about the Corpus Christi Crabbies?
This is a good team. I like a lot of what this team has going on. You got, it has I really like the Dragon's Fairy Steel Core, the Garchomp Mimikyu Registeel. That's super nice defensive synergy, especially because it lets Garchomp switch out of ice moves rather safely. And there's a couple other ice switch-ins that are solid on this comp. Zapdos, Garchomp. I've actually seen it underperform in a couple of drafts, leagues that I've done, but it's very difficult to prep for, and they've got nice speed tiers and a ton of power off the bat. And I do think they're supported well with the Scrafty and the Mimikyu primarily, and the Mr. Rhyme, which we'll get into in a bit. The Miltank as a Sap Sippermon is fine. I don't think it's going to do a lot here overall, unless you're insane like Johnny. That's a reference for MDL. If you want to watch Season 1, you can go all the way back to Season 1. The Magmortar's nice to give this team a little bit more special offense, since it's getting some good physical offense from the Registeel, Garchomp, Scrafty. And Mr. Rhyme is actually an extremely good mod. People sleep on it all the time. Its move pool is super good. It gets Fake Out. It gets Ice Shard to like proc the Zapdos mostly with like a weakness policy. And this team has good Trick Room as well because Mimikyu is one of the best setters. So even though this team doesn't operate insanely well in Trick Room, it can. But the fact that Mimikyu get Trick Room and can deny Trick Room consistently, I think is really important for a team like this. It's just got a lot of damage. You're going to have a hard time stopping this team from just clicking buttons on you, I think. And that's, like, the skill cap is not as high as the Gardener Guzzlord's team, but, like, just the off-the-bat, like, threat level of the team is insanely high, which I value quite a bit, personally.
Yeah, there's a lot of really powerful things that this team can do. I was talking to the coach a little bit about the Rose Raid selection. They are potentially looking at Sap Sipper with Miltank. Like, that was at least a brief consideration in that. So
that's fun. The Petal Blizzard, yeah. It's kind of goofy. I've seen it done.
I want to see it. I'm not going to lie. That could be very fun. I do think what this team is lacking, and the thing that keeps it out of the top spot, is a really good Trick Room attacker. Like, everything else on this team is great. Replace the Rose Raid with something like a Delmise, and maybe we're talking about the best team in the league. And that keeps just as like a slow grass type attacker, for example. But beyond that, I think Krabioff obviously went into this draft with a plan and executed it pretty well. Like, everything seems solid. There doesn't really seem to be a major hole.
It's very intentional. I will say having both Tentacruel and Wishcast is a little weird to me, but I don't know what those mons are going to do per se. I've seen Tentacruel do well before, but it's kind of a polarizing mon, I think.
Yeah, I believe season 1 of the VBA, Wishcash went off for an entire season, so that could be part of the influence there. I don't know exactly what it does, but I mean, just look into its eyes and know that you are going to be seeing your own god soon.
Yeah.
But Maxwell, what are your thoughts on this team?
Yeah, no, Disquake is super strong. With Ryan, again, we've both seen this core, the Garchomp and Zapdos, kind of underperform a little bit. I do think in the MDL last season, I think was its best showing that I've seen. And it is just incredibly hard to prep for. Not to mention Zapdos with Weather Ball actually looks really, really good on this team. You know, you can max Garchomp and set Sand. You can max the Tentacool even and set the Rain. Or you can go off kind of crazily and max the Magmortar and set the Sun. And your Zapdos all of a sudden has super good coverage. I do think this is the strongest fantasy core. And I also think it is one of the stronger low-tier Fire, Water, Grass cores. The Wishcash is a little weird since you already do have that water and that ground type. But it's tier 5, so it's whatever. I'm not knocking you for it. But overall, this is just a solidly good, balanced offensive team that you really have to prep for probably all of these mons in a given week, which is just phenomenal.
Yeah, I don't think that can be overstated. Like, this is probably the team in the league that I would have the hardest time prepping for if I went up against, because I wouldn't just be able to say, oh, yep, Magmortar's not coming, for example. Whereas for other teams, I can just, cross off 2 or 3 off the list right away and say, like, okay, these are the 8 I actually have to prep for. Like, I could see any of these 11 coming to any given matchup, and that's pretty terrifying. But speaking of terrifying, let's move on to our number 1 selection. Maxwell, this one's your team, the Shambana Shellos. I'm kidding, of course, but Maxwell was the front office for Burst. So
Yep.
I think I will let you break this down since you were sort of in on his draft process with him and have a better idea of why he might have picked some of the things that he picked.
So one of the main points that I've been talking through all of these teams' draft is just checking boxes. And if you've followed Dan's channel, when he did some of his how to do draft league, he talked about a checklist, and that was one of the points that I gave him. And me knowing Burst relatively well, we're from the same area, competed at a couple regionals together, and just being in multiple draft leagues together, I asked him, I said, hey, I would really like to help you kind of help you break out of your shell. He had kind of down seasons in the MDL, and he's not really having one now. He's kind of been popping off, but I've noticed that he kind of struggles in the drafting portion. So I was like, hey, if I can just help you with this, I think you prep and play phenomenally. I just want to help you bring it to the next level. So I did have a little bit of input on most all of these mons. But again, he did have the ultimate say. And we, again, just checking the boxes, fire with the Cinderace, Cinderace is a multifaceted mon, but you have the fire, water, grass core with the Tangela, Rotom, and the Cinderace. You have the fairy, dragon, steel with the Aromatisse, Druddigon, and Capparaja, even though Cinderace is probably the best steel type. You have your dark, psychic, fighting. Everything is just checked here. And one of the big things about this team that I absolutely love is actually the Tangrowth. I'm currently using it now, and it forces your opponent to prep in a way that takes an item slot away from majority their main sweeping options. So if your main sweeper's running safety goggles, it's not an offensive item, so your calcs might get a little better. Tangrowth can also sweep itself, Even if you're not running Gmax Cinderace, you can set the Sun, and Chlorophyll Tangrowth can go off. The Trick Room anti-Trick Room mode is actually really, really good. Again, with the Tangrowth, the Caparaja, Aromatisse at base 29, multiple fake out options, multiple defensive synergistic options. The Drapion, I believe, is going to be one of the more slept on defensive versatile mons with the Snarls, and also just being able to go off offensively. There's a reason this team is number one, and I just think Burst did a phenomenal job drafting and checking those boxes that I believe really make a good draft team.
Yeah, absolutely. I can agree with a lot of that. I know in this most recent MDL season, I had him in last place in my preseason PRs. So this is massive turnaround just in draft and the ability to execute. He's always been a coach that can execute, but has been held back by the quality of his team. And I think in this case, he's got value in basically every slot.
Every slot.
Yeah, maybe not the Dragon, but everything else is definitely very valuable and is going to come pretty consistently. So I think having that many pieces of value is definitely going to help him. But what do you think, Ryan?
Ryan, real quick, talk about those Drudagon calcs.
Yeah, Drudagon's dumb as hell. Stupid mon. I've used it before. I drafted it in MDL last season. It actually gets okay calcs. The problem is it doesn't get anything that's pure force boosted stab. So it's like you'll run like Dragon Claw and then the elemental punches, and the elemental punches do as much damage as your dumb Dragon Claw because of how the math works out. It is actually a pretty okay mon. For a tier 4 dragon type, I think it's pretty solid. No, the big thing actually with this team that is the reason I placed it in first was mostly that top core of the Cinderace, Rotom Wash, Articuno G Tangrowth. Articuno's so good here. Having a competitive mon to neuter the Intimidates from opposing teams on a team with a lot of physical offense is really smart. And I love that that thing gets both Tailwind and Trick Room. So he can even like run a sweeping Aromatisse. He gets a lot of flexibility out of that. Like he can just lead like Articuno G Rotom, and then he can Tailwind with it, he can Trick Room with it, he can max that, he can max Rotom, he can Nasty Plot. Like there's just so many options available to this team. It's very similar to the Garden of Guzzlords, where it has a lot of that versatility, and you need to prep for all 11 mons, and he got great value in every tier. Cinderace is one of the best tier 1s, Rotom's one of the best tier 2s, Aromatisse is the best TR setter in my opinion. Crocodile's one of the best tier 3s. Drudagon and Drapion are pretty good tier 4s. They're not the best, but they're good. Hitmonchan's probably the best tier 5. Articuno G is one of the best tier 2s. Tangrowth, one of the best tier 3s, etc., etc. Like, there's just so much value here, and it all works together. There's a lot of versatility. He can earn different abilities on different mons, with notably the Purple and the Tangrowth. And it just works super well together. I mean, the thing that this team has over the other ones is it has sold me the most on its Trick Room mode and its Tailwind mode, and it has sold me that this team can lead something and be terrifying. If you're the opponent for this team, like, what are you gonna lead? Like, what are you expecting him to lead? He could lead literally anything, as far as I can tell. I mean, he could lead Croak Cinderace, he could lead Articuno Tangrowth, he could lead Aromatisse Caparaja. Like, there's just so many options, and they're all super viable, and they all work really, really well with each other. I think this is a really, really phenomenal draft team, and I'm very excited to see if Burst can have a successful season with it.
Yeah, absolutely. But with that being said, we can move into our final power rankings. As always, these mean literally nothing for the long-term season, but this is just where we think each of the teams stand at the end. Do you guys have any closing thoughts before I take us on out?
No. This is the middle division, right? There's like 3 divisions for this. Okay. Based on team building from the start and not really play, because I literally know only one person in this entire draft. If you look at the numbers that were at the bottom, which are averages, there was kind of a clear disconnect from, I think it was 5 to 6. There was more of a jump there. I think a lot of these teams get a lot closer to where there's not that big jump if like 2 transactions are made, and it mostly comes down to type cores for me. So if you're some of those bottom teams that I kind of roasted myself, don't take it to heart. Just take it as me being very constructive about your team. And if it's advice you want to take and it makes you better, please do it. I don't want to kind of knock anybody. I want to see competitiveness at its fullest, and especially a league like this where I think it's more of a learning experience for a lot of these coaches. And if you need anything, I'm sure you can talk to Dan and Ryan. They'll give you my Discord. I am always here to help prep, calcs, just transaction questions. Just if you need anything, reach out to them and they'll get a hold of me, or you can find me yourself. So yeah, good luck to everybody.
Ryan, anything before I take us out?
Yeah, there's just a lot of good teams. I am for those of you who aren't aware, I'm actually the admin for this division. So I'm very excited to see what's going to come out of you all. I do think some of these teams are very, very strong. I think every team here has a lot of potential. But like a lot of the teams that are on the lower end of the PRs could have been on the top end of the PRs with 1 or 2 slight changes, which I think is a good sign. There are occasionally we'll do PRs and we'll be like, even after 8 transactions, I don't know if your team will be fixed. Like that's happened in MDL. You can go watch those videos and see Axwell and I just like outright say that. The fact that we're saying, hey, if there's like 1 or 2 things that are a little bit different here, and I think it like jumps up to a top team, that's a very good sign for how well this is going to go. And in the end, it all comes down to player skill. And we like being proven wrong too. There's been times where we've had takes in our videos, or we've had them on that we're not sure what it does, and it totally pops up. Thievel, Auroras, a couple mons like that come to mind as being things that we've been like, oh wow, that like really did a nice job and we were not expecting that. So prove us wrong. Like if you think that something was disagreed with or whatever, and you come into your games and you pop off with it, like we're always really actually genuinely excited to see that. So we're basing a lot of this on past experience though. We've done a lot of leagues. We've seen almost every single mon drafted at this point. So we do know what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you two again for joining me for this power ranking. This is the last of the 3 divisions that I covered, so all 3 will be up if you're watching this now. But if you do see anything that you disagree with, please just let me know in the comment section below. And don't forget to like and subscribe as well. But on behalf of IzzyMax and Piano Guy 27, my name is Dan, this was Stout Gaming, and thank you guys for joining us. Bye.